The golden afternoon sun blazed across the vast Montana territory, its heat nearly as oppressive as Willow Nielsen's desperation to make it to Fort Benton before nightfall. The steep grade ahead of her, the last major obstacle on this grueling journey, seemed to mock her determination as she urged her tired team of horses forward, the wagon creaking ominously beneath the weight of her possessions and fading hopes. Willow had been traveling for nearly 2 months since leaving St. Louis, her heart as heavy as the trunks filled with her late father's belongings. At 24, she was making this journey alone, a fact that still shocked proper society. But necessity had forced her hand after receiving word that her uncle's trading post needed her help. The promise of a new life in the Montana territory was the only thing that kept her pushing forward, even as each mile seemed longer than the last. The grinding crack that split the air was as devastating as a gunshot. The wagon lurched violently to one side, nearly toppling over as the rear axle splintered beneath the strain of the steep incline. Willow barely managed to bring the team to a halt, her knuckles white against the reins as she fought to keep the horses from dragging the damaged wagon further down the slope. "No, no, no," she whispered, dismounting carefully to survey the damage. The broken axle was beyond her ability to repair, and the nearest town was still 15 miles ahead. The afternoon was fading, and being stranded on this desolate stretch of trail after dark meant certain danger from wildlife, the elements, or worse. Tears of frustration burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was considering her limited options when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her reach instinctively for the small pistol tucked in her skirt pocket. The rider appeared over the ridge, silhouetted against the amber sky, tall in the saddle, with broad shoulders and the unmistakable wide-brimmed hat of a cattleman. Willow tensed as he approached, her hand still hovering near her weapon. "Afternoon, madam," he called, his voice deep and clear in the still air. He reined his chestnut stallion to a stop several yards away, a respectful distance that immediately eased some of Willow's apprehension. "Looks like you've got yourself a predicament." As he dismounted, Willow got her first good look at him. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His jaw was strong beneath several days' worth of stubble, and despite the trail dust covering his clothes, there was something undeniably dignified about his bearing. "Axle's completely gone," she explained, gesturing to the broken wagon. "I'm afraid I'm rather stranded." The stranger knelt to examine the damage, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. "Xavier Jensen," he introduced himself, glancing up at her. "Most folks call me Xav." "Willow Nielsen," she replied, trying to maintain her composure despite her dire situation. Xavier's assessment was quick but thorough. "This can't be fixed on the trail. You're headed to Fort Benton?" "Yes, my uncle runs Nielsen's trading post there." Xavier stood, brushing dust from his hands. "I know the place, been there a few times." His eyes scanned the trail ahead, then back to the wagon. "Sun's getting low. We need to get you and this wagon somewhere safe before nightfall." "But how?" "I can't possibly. I'll shoulder it," Xavier said simply, moving toward the broken end of the wagon. "You guide the team. If we work together, we can keep this balanced enough to make it to the Miller homestead about 3 miles ahead. They're good people. They'll help us get this properly fixed." Willow stared at him in disbelief. "You can't possibly," but Xavier was already positioning himself at the broken corner of the wagon, bracing his shoulder under the bed. "I've carried heavier loads farther distances, Miss Nielsen. The weight isn't the problem, it's keeping it balanced so we don't damage anything else. I'll support this corner, and you keep those horses steady. Slow and careful will get us there." There was such certainty in his voice that Willow found herself nodding despite her doubts. She climbed back onto the driver's seat, gathering the reins in her hands. "Ready when you are, Mr. Jensen." Xavier settled the weight of the wagon corner against his shoulder, grimacing slightly as he found the right position. "Easy now, just keep them at a walk." Willow clicked her tongue gently, and the horses moved forward. The wagon shifted precariously for a moment before Xavier adjusted his stance, bearing more of the weight. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice strained but steady. "You're doing fine." And so they began their strange procession down the trail, Willow guiding the team of horses while Xavier walked alongside, supporting the broken corner of the wagon on his shoulder. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. "May I ask what brings you out this way alone, Miss Nielsen?" Xavier asked after they had traveled in silence for some time. Willow hesitated, then decided there was little harm in sharing her story with the man who was quite literally shouldering her burden. "My father passed 6 months ago in St. Louis. Pneumonia took him rather quickly," she explained, keeping her eyes on the trail ahead. "I received word from my uncle that he needed help at his trading post. With nothing left for me back east, it seemed the logical choice." "I'm sorry about your father," Xavier said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice warmed something inside her. "Thank you. He was a good man. Adventurous too, he spent years out west before settling in St. Louis to marry my mother." She adjusted her grip on the reins. "And you, Mr. Jensen?" "What's your story?" Xavier shifted the wagon's weight on his shoulder, his muscles straining visibly beneath his shirt. "Ranch foreman for the Double Creek outfit. Just finished delivering a herd to the railroad in Great Falls. I'm headed back to the ranch now." Alone, a shadow crossed his face. "My men are a day ahead. Had some business to finish." There was something in his tone that suggested the business wasn't entirely pleasant, but Willow didn't press. The miles stretched before them, and Xavier's breathing grew heavier as he continued to support the wagon's weight. "We should rest a moment," Willow suggested, concerned by the sweat now streaming down his face. Xavier shook his head. "Better to keep going, sun's fading fast." His determination was admirable, but Willow could see the strain taking its toll. Still, they pressed onward, the wagon creaking ominously with each step. As they crested a small rise, Xavier pointed with his free hand. "There, see the chimney smoke. That's the Miller place." Relief flooded through Willow as she spotted the small homestead nestled in a protected valley ahead. A modest cabin without buildings sat amid fields of wheat, a thin column of smoke rising from the stone chimney. "Just a little farther," she encouraged, though whether she was speaking to Xavier or herself, she wasn't entirely sure. The final approach to the Miller homestead seemed endless, but at last they arrived at the front gate. Before Willow could call out, the cabin door swung open, and a sturdy man with a thick beard emerged, followed by a woman wiping her hands on an apron. "Good Lord above!" the man exclaimed, rushing forward. "What happened here?" Axel snapped on the grade, Xavier explained, his voice tight with exertion. "Need a place to make repairs." Of course," the man said, immediately moving to help support the wagon. "I'm Thomas Miller. This here's my wife, Sarah." With Thomas's help, they maneuvered the wagon into the yard near the barn. As soon as it was safely settled, Xavier stepped away, rolling his shoulder with a grimace. "You're both welcome to stay until we can get this fixed," Sarah Miller said, her kind eyes taking in Willow's travel-worn appearance. "Dinner's nearly ready and we've got plenty." "That's very kind of you," Willow said, gratitude overwhelming her. "I can pay for your trouble." Thomas waved away her offer. "Neighborliness doesn't come with a price tag out here, miss. We help each other because tomorrow it might be us needing the help." As they unhitched the horses and settled them in the Miller's barn, Willow found herself watching Xavier. Despite his obvious exhaustion, he worked efficiently, his movements speaking of years of experience with animals and the demands of trail life. "Thank you," she said quietly as they walked toward the cabin. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Xavier glanced down at her, a small smile softening his weathered features. "Just happened to be in the right place." "Nevertheless, I'm grateful." Inside the Miller cabin, the warmth and aroma of home-cooked food enveloped them. After proper introductions were made, Sarah insisted they both wash up before dinner. Willow was shown to a small side room where a basin of water and clean towel awaited. She scrubbed the trail dust from her face and hands, then loosened her hair from its tight bun, massaging her scalp where it had pulled all day. When she emerged, Xavier was seated at the table, his hair damp and his face cleaned of trail dust. Without the layer of grime, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, likely no more than 30. The Miller's 2 young children were peppering him with questions about his life as a cowboy, which he answered with patient good humor. Over a hearty meal of venison stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches, Thomas Miller explained that he could help repair the wagon, but it would take at least 2 days to fashion a new axle. "I've got some seasoned oak that'll work," he said between bites. But it'll need shaping and we'll have to get the metal fittings from the old axle. I'd be happy to help with the labor, Xavier offered. It's the least I can do, Willow frowned. But surely you have to get back to your ranch, Xavier shrugged. Another day or two won't make much difference. My boss knows I'm reliable. As darkness fell outside, Sarah showed Willow to a small sleeping alcove separated from the main room by a curtain. It's not much privacy, she apologized, but it's the best we can offer. It's more than generous, Willow assured her, touched by the woman's kindness. Xavier would sleep in the barn. An arrangement he insisted was perfectly comfortable for a man accustomed to bedding down under the stars. As the household settled for the night, Willow lay on the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Miller home. Her thoughts kept returning to the mysterious cowboy who had appeared when she needed help most. Morning came early on the homestead. By the time Willow awoke, Xavier and Thomas were already in the barn, assessing the wagon damage in the clear light of day. She found them deep in discussion, shirt sleeves rolled up despite the early morning chill. "Morning, Miss Nielsen," Xavier said, tipping his hat. "Afraid the news isn't great. The axle's completely shattered and the wheel hub is damaged too." Thomas nodded grimly. "It'll take 3 days at least, maybe 4. I'm sorry," Willow's heart sank. Every day delayed was another day her uncle's trading post struggled without her help. "Is there any way to expedite the repairs?" "If we had the right parts, maybe," Thomas said. "But we'll have to make most of them from scratch." Xavier studied her crestfallen expression. "There's a freight wagon stopped over at Clearwater Creek about 10 miles from here. The driver, Emmett Walsh, usually carries spare parts. If he has what we need, it could save considerable time." "Then we should go immediately," Willow said. "Hold on now," Thomas interjected. "It's rough country between here and Clearwater, not a journey for a lady alone." Xavier straightened. "I'll ride out there. If Walsh has the parts, I'll bring them back by nightfall." "I'm coming with you," Willow stated firmly, in a tone that brooked no argument. "This is my wagon, my responsibility." Xavier studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Can you ride astride? It'll be faster than taking a wagon." "I can ride anything with 4 legs, Mr. Jensen," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "My father made certain of that." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I don't doubt it, Miss Nielsen. We'll leave within the hour." Sarah loaned Willow a pair of her son's trousers to wear beneath her skirt, for the ride a scandalous but practical solution that Willow gratefully accepted. By mid-morning, she and Xavier were mounted and ready to depart. Thomas had provided a rough map to Clearwater Creek, and Sarah had packed them food for the journey. "Be careful," Sarah cautioned as they prepared to leave. "Storms brewing to the west." Willow glanced at the distant horizon where dark clouds were indeed gathering. Xavier followed her gaze and frowned. "We'll outride it," he said confidently, adjusting his hat. "Let's go." They set off at a steady pace, Xavier leading the way on his chestnut stallion while Willow rode a steady bay mare borrowed from the Millers. Once they cleared the homestead, Xavier increased their pace to a canter, eating up the miles across the rolling grassland. Willow kept pace easily, her riding skills proving every bit as competent as she'd claimed. Xavier glanced at her occasionally, his expression a mixture of approval and something else she couldn't quite identify. "You ride well," he commented during a brief rest to water the horses. "My father believed women should know how to handle themselves," Willow explained, stretching her back. "He taught me to ride, shoot, and manage accounts, all things my mother thought highly improper." "Your mother sounds like a traditional woman." "She was," Willow agreed, a trace of sadness in her voice. "She passed when I was 16. Never quite approved of my unladylike tendencies, as she called them." Xavier handed her his canteen. "Those unladylike tendencies will serve you well out here. The Montana Territory doesn't much care for society's rules about what women can and cannot do." "Is that why you came west?" she asked, taking a drink. "To escape society's rules," a shadow crossed his face. "Something like that." Before she could inquire further, he was back in the saddle, gesturing toward a line of trees in the distance. "Clearwater Creek is just beyond that ridge. We should keep moving." The weather was deteriorating more rapidly than they had anticipated. By the time they reached the small settlement of Clearwater Creek, little more than a trading post, saloon, and a few scattered cabins, the wind had picked up considerably. carrying the scent of rain. The freight wagon was parked outside the trading post, its canvas covering securely tied down against the coming storm. Xavier helped Willow dismount, then tied their horses to the hitching rail. "Wait here," he instructed. "I'll find Walsh." "I'm perfectly capable of—" "I know you're capable," Xavier interrupted, his voice softening. "But some of these men haven't seen a woman in months. Let me find Walsh first, then we'll negotiate together." Reluctantly, Willow agreed, waiting near the horses while Xavier disappeared into the trading post. Through the grimy window, she could see several men inside, most gathered around a pot-bellied stove despite the warmth of the day. Their faces turned as Xavier entered, and there was something in their expressions that made Willow uneasy. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour before Xavier finally emerged, accompanied by a barrel-chested man with an impressive red beard. The man's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Willow, but he tipped his hat respectfully. "Miss Nielsen, this is Emmett Walsh," Xavier introduced. "He might have what we need, but he wants to see the specifications first." Walsh nodded. "Never sell a part without knowing it'll fit, madam." Bad for business when folks come back angry. Willow reached into her satchel and withdrew the measurements Thomas had carefully written down that morning. "Would these suffice, Mr. Walsh?" The freighter studied the paper, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Might have something close. Let me check my inventory." As Walsh walked toward his wagon, the door to the saloon across the street banged open, and three men staggered out, clearly deep in their cups despite the early hour. They spotted Willow immediately, their raucous conversation dying as they focused on her. Xavier moved subtly closer to Willow, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. "Problem?" she murmured. "Hopefully not," he replied quietly, "but stay close." The three men began ambling toward them, the tallest of the group a lanky fellow with a pockmarked face leading the way. His smile revealed several missing teeth as he approached. "Well now, what have we here? Pretty lady like you's a rare sight in these parts." His gaze slid from Willow to Xavier and back again. "You sharing, Cowboy?" Xavier's voice was dangerously soft. "Move along, friend. The lady's not interested in conversation." The man's companions snickered, but something in Xavier's stance made them hang back. The leader, however, was either too drunk or too foolish to recognize the warning signs. "Didn't ask if she wanted conversation," he leered, taking another step forward. What happened next occurred so quickly that Willow barely had time to register it. Xavier moved like lightning, his right hand shooting out to grip the man's shirt front while his left pressed the barrel of his revolver under the man's chin. "Last chance," Xavier said, his voice so low Willow could barely hear it. "Walk away." The drunk's face paled beneath his weathered tan. His companions backed up several steps, hands raised in surrender. "Easy now, Jensen," one of them said. "Bart's just had too much whiskey, we don't want no trouble." Xavier's head snapped toward the speaker, recognition flashing in his eyes. Slowly, he lowered his weapon and released Bart's shirt, though he remained positioned between the men and Willow. "Take him back to the saloon and sober him up," Xavier ordered. "And tell him when he wakes tomorrow that he owes the lady an apology." The men hastily collected their friend, practically dragging him back across the street. Willow released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They knew you," she observed quietly. Xavier holstered his weapon, his jaw tight. "I've worked cattle in this territory for 8 years. You meet all kinds." Before she could press further, Walsh returned, his arms full of metal fittings and wooden parts. "Think I might have what you need," he announced, seemingly oblivious to the tension lingering in the air. "It'll need some adjusting, but the base is solid." After examining the parts and negotiating a fair price, they secured their purchase to the horses. The first fat droplets of rain were beginning to fall as they prepared to depart. "You're welcome to wait out the storm here," Walsh offered, looking concerned at the darkening sky. "There's rooms above the trading post." Xavier glanced at Willow, leaving the decision to her. She considered the option briefly, but something about the settlement and the men still watching them from the saloon doorway made her uneasy. "I think we should try to make it back," she decided. "We can shelter along the way if necessary." Xavier nodded, helping her mount before swinging into his own saddle. "We'll take the southern route back," he told her as they rode out. "It's longer but more sheltered if this storm hits full force." The rain intensified as they left Clearwater Creek behind, driven by a strengthening wind that bent the prairie grasses in undulating waves. Willow pulled her coat tighter. Grateful for the oiled canvas, Xavier had insisted she drape over her shoulders before they departed. They rode in silence for several miles, pushing the horses as much as they dared on the increasingly slick ground. The southern route Xavier had chosen took them through more varied terrain. Stands of cottonwoods and aspen provided brief shelter from the rain, while rocky outcroppings occasionally broke the force of the wind. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead," Xavier called over the growing roar of the storm. "Used it during roundups. It's not much, but it's solid." Willow nodded, too cold and wet to waste energy on words. Her hands were nearly numb around the reins, and her borrowed trousers were soaked through beneath her skirt, when lightning split the sky directly ahead, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Both horses shied violently. Willow's mare reared, almost unseating her. She managed to stay mounted, but in the chaos, one of the axle parts came loose from its ties and clattered to the ground. Xavier dismounted quickly to retrieve it, struggling to secure it again with cold, stiffened fingers. "We need to get to shelter now," he shouted over the wind. "This is turning dangerous." The line shack appeared just as Willow was beginning to fear they might have missed it in the driving rain, a small, sturdy structure nestled against a rocky hillside. Xavier dismounted first, helping Willow down from her horse before leading both animals to a lean-to shelter attached to the side of the cabin. The interior of the line shack was spare but mercifully dry. A small iron stove occupied one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in another. A narrow bunk with a straw mattress was built into the wall opposite the door. "Not exactly the Palmer House Hotel," Xavier commented wryly, striking a match to light the coal oil lamp hanging from a ceiling beam. "It's paradise compared to being out in that," Willow replied, her teeth chattering as she hugged herself for warmth. Xavier immediately set about starting a fire in the stove, working with practiced efficiency despite his wet clothing. "There should be dry blankets in that trunk," he said, nodding toward a wooden chest beneath the bunk, "and you'll need to get out of those wet clothes." Willow's cheeks warmed despite her chill. "I haven't anything else to wear. There might be something in there too." Ranch hands sometimes leave extra gear. He kept his back turned, focusing intently on the stove. "I'll tend to the horses once I get this fire going. You can change while I'm out." True to his word, as soon as flames were crackling in the stove, Xavier excused himself to check on the horses. Willow opened the trunk, finding several rough wool blankets, a couple of flannel shirts, and a pair of canvas trousers that looked as though they might fit a man of smaller stature than Xavier. She quickly stripped off her wet clothing, shivering violently as the cool air hit her damp skin. She dried herself as best she could with one of the blankets, then pulled on a flannel shirt that hung nearly to her knees. The trousers were indeed too small for Xavier, but still comically large on her frame. She cinched them at the waist with a length of rope from the trunk, rolled up the cuffs, and wrapped herself in one of the blankets. By the time Xavier returned, she had hung her wet clothes near the stove and was huddled as close to the heat as she dared. He paused in the doorway, rainwater streaming from his hat and coat. "Horses are settled," he reported, his eyes carefully averted from her makeshift attire. "Storm's getting worse. We'll be here for the night." Willow nodded, trying to ignore the impropriety of their situation. Unchaperoned in a one-room cabin with a man she barely knew, it was the stuff of ruined reputations, yet the alternative was far worse. "There are dry clothes in the trunk," she told him, "and I've left you a blanket." Xavier thanked her and, with the same consideration he'd shown earlier, asked her to turn her back while he changed. Willow obliged, focusing on the patterns of raindrops against the small window while listening to the rustle of fabric behind her. "All decent," he announced moments later. She turned to find him similarly attired in dry clothes that fit his tall frame better than hers did. His hair was damp and tousled, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable than the hard-edged cowboy who had confronted the drunks in Clearwater Creek. "I'm afraid our dinner options are limited," he said, producing a small sack from his saddlebag. "Jerky, hardtack, and the remains of Sarah's cornbread." "A feast," Willow replied with a small smile. "After the day we've had, I'm grateful for anything." They sat at the small table, sharing their modest meal as the storm raged outside. The line shack creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind, but it held firm, the stove radiating blessed heat throughout the single room. As they ate, Willow found herself studying Xavier more carefully. There was a story behind those storm-gray eyes, one he seemed reluctant to share. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of hard physical labor, yet he handled the chipped enamel cups with surprising gentleness. "How long have you worked for Double Creek?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "About 5 years now," he replied, breaking a piece of hardtack. "Started as just another hand, worked my way up to foreman last year when old Bill Hastings retired. You must be good at what you do." A half-smile curved his mouth. "I understand cattle, sometimes better than people, and before Double Creek," his expression shuddered slightly, "drifted mostly, worked ranches from Texas to Wyoming. That's a lot of territory to cover." Xavier took a sip from his cup, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. "Sometimes a man needs to keep moving." Willow recognized the deflection but decided not to press. Everyone was entitled to their secrets, after all. She had a few of her own. "What about your uncle's trading post?" Xavier asked, turning the conversation away from himself. "You planning to stay on permanently?" Willow considered the question. "I'm not entirely sure. Uncle Henry's letter mentioned he was getting too old to run the place alone, and with my experience keeping my father's books, I could be useful. Beyond that," she shrugged, "I haven't planned that far ahead. The territory's changing fast," Xavier observed. "Railroads pushing through, more settlers arriving every month. Trading posts are good business if you know what you're doing. Do you think a woman can make it out here, truly?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, voicing a doubt she'd carried since leaving St. Louis. Xavier studied her for a long moment. "I've known women who have carved out lives here that would make Eastern men quake in their boots. It's not easy, nothing worthwhile ever is. But if you've got courage and sense, which you seem to have in abundance, you'll do fine." His confidence in her, a woman he barely knew, warmed something deep inside Willow that had been cold since her father's passing. "Thank you," she said softly, "for that and for everything else today." Xavier's gaze met hers across the table, and something electric passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood what it meant to face the wilderness alone. The moment stretched, then broke as a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin's shutters. Xavier cleared his throat, rising to add more wood to the stove. "We should try to get some rest," he said, his voice gruff. "You take the bunk, I'll make do on the floor." "Don't be ridiculous," Willow protested. "That floor is hard as stone, and you've already done enough physical labor today shouldering my wagon." "It's not proper. Propriety is a luxury we can't afford tonight, Mr. Jensen," she interrupted, practical as ever. "The bunk is narrow but sufficient for both of us if we're careful. We can place a blanket between us if it eases your conscience." Xavier looked momentarily stunned by her pragmatism, then a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Your father raised an unconventional woman, Miss Nielsen. He raised a survivor," she corrected. "Now, shall we get some sleep before we collapse from exhaustion?" Their sleeping arrangement was awkward but functional, both fully clothed, lying back to back with a blanket serving as a barrier between them. Despite her matter-of-fact approach, Willow found her heart racing at the proximity of his solid warmth. It had been a long time since she'd been this close to anyone, let alone a man. "Good night, Miss Nielsen," Xavier said quietly. "Good night, Mr. Jensen," she replied, closing her eyes against the strange intimacy of the moment. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless, the exhaustion of the day pulling her under despite the storm's continued fury outside. Willow woke to sunlight streaming through the small window and the unfamiliar sensation of warmth against her back. Sometime during the night, the blanket barrier had shifted, and she now found herself nestled against Xavier's solid form, his arm draped protectively around her waist. For a moment, she remained perfectly still, torn between propriety's demand that she move away immediately and the treacherous comfort of being held after so many months of solitude. Before she could decide, Xavier stirred behind her, his breathing changing as he woke. There was a moment of confused stillness, then he carefully withdrew his arm and shifted away. "I apologize," he said, his voice rough with sleep. I didn't mean to, it's all right, Willow interrupted, sitting up and smoothing her borrowed shirt. We were asleep, no harm done. They moved about the small cabin with careful politeness, gathering their now dry clothing and preparing for the journey back to the Miller homestead. Outside, the world was washed clean by the storm, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch forever. The horses had weathered the night well in their sheltered lean-to, and the axle parts were thankfully undamaged. As they prepared to depart, Willow found herself reluctant to leave the simple cabin that had sheltered them through the night, a strange sentiment she couldn't quite explain. The ride back to the Millers was uneventful, the landscape transformed by the recent rainfall. Streams that had been mere trickles now rushed with clear water, and wildflowers that had been dormant now dotted the prairie with splashes of color. They spoke little, but the silence between them had shifted, grown comfortable, even companionable. Occasionally their eyes would meet, and Willow would feel that same spark of recognition that had passed between them the night before. The Millers were clearly relieved when they rode into the yard around midday. Sarah rushed out to meet them, her face etched with concern. "We were worried sick," she exclaimed. "That storm was terrible. Thomas was preparing to come search for you this morning." "We found shelter," Xavier explained, helping Willow dismount, "and we got the parts." Thomas examined their purchases with appreciation. "These are perfect. We can start work immediately. Should have your wagon ready in 2 days. 2 more days." Willow found herself strangely conflicted about the news. On one hand, she was eager to continue her journey to Fort Benton and begin her new life. On the other, her gaze drifted to Xavier, who was unsaddling the horses with efficient movements. Over the next 2 days, a routine developed. Xavier and Thomas worked on the wagon from dawn until dusk, replacing the broken axle and repairing the damaged wheel hub. Willow helped Sarah with household tasks and minded the children, finding unexpected joy in the simple rhythm of homestead life. In the evenings, they gathered around the table for meals, sharing stories and laughter. Xavier gradually revealed more of himself, tales of cattle drives and the characters he'd met in his years of ranching. He spoke of the beauty of Montana's changing seasons, the satisfaction of work well done, and his dreams of someday having his own small spread. Willow, in turn, told them about her life in St. Louis, her father's adventurous spirit, and her mother's genteel disapproval of nearly everything Willow enjoyed. She spoke of her passion for figures and business, and how she'd helped her father manage his modest shipping company after her mother's death. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Thomas announced that the wagon repairs were complete. "She's as good as new," he declared proudly. "Maybe better." Xavier ran his hand along the new axle, nodding in satisfaction. "Solid work. It'll get you to Fort Benton without trouble." Willow felt a curious hollow sensation in her chest. "Thank you both. I don't know how to repay such kindness." "No repayment necessary," Thomas assured her, "though Sarah would probably appreciate a letter now and then letting us know how you're faring." That evening, their last at the Miller homestead, had a bittersweet quality. The children presented Willow with wildflowers they'd picked, and Sarah packed a basket of provisions for her journey. After the household had retired for the night, Willow found herself unable to sleep, stepping outside to gaze at the star-filled sky. She wasn't entirely surprised when Xavier joined her, his footsteps quiet on the packed earth of the yard. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, standing beside her. "Too much on my mind, I suppose," Xavier nodded, understanding without need for explanation. "Fort Benton's a good town, you'll do well there, and you, back to Double Creek tomorrow. That's the plan." He hesitated, then added, "It's only about 2 days' ride from Fort Benton. If you ever need anything." Willow turned to face him, finding his expression unusually vulnerable in the moonlight. "Mr. Jensen, Xavier, I don't quite know how to thank you. If you hadn't come along when you did, you'd have figured something out," he said with confidence. "You're resourceful. Perhaps, but I'm glad it was you who found me." Something shifted in his eyes, a decision being made. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, Xavier reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm and slightly calloused. "Willow," he said softly, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. She didn't move away. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly into his touch, her heart racing beneath her ribs. With infinite care, Xavier bent his head and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss so gentle it might have been a whisper. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of regret or dismay. Willow answered by reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I leave tomorrow," she reminded him, her voice barely audible. "I know." His hands framed her face with exquisite tenderness. "But I had to just once before you go." They stood together under the vast Montana sky, the moment stretching between them like a promise neither was quite ready to make. Finally, Xavier stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. "Good night, Willow Nielsen," he said formally, though his eyes held anything but formality. "Good night, Xavier Jensen," she replied, watching as he walked back to the barn, his silhouette tall against the star-scattered night. Morning brought a flurry of activity as they prepared for departure. The wagon was loaded, the team hitched, and goodbyes exchanged with the Miller family. Xavier would ride south to Double Creek while Willow continued northwest to Fort Benton. "Write to us when you get settled," Sarah insisted, embracing Willow warmly. "And come visit when you can." "I will," Willow promised, touched by the woman's kindness. Finally, there was nothing left but to say goodbye to Xavier. He stood beside his saddled horse, hat in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Safe travels, Miss Nielsen," he said formally, aware of the Millers watching from the porch. "And to you, Mr. Jensen." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "Directions to Double Creek. In case you ever find yourself heading that way." Their fingers brushed as she took it, that same electric current passing between them. "Thank you." Xavier mounted his horse, settling his hat on his head. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something more, but instead, he simply nodded, turning his horse toward the south. Willow climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. With a final wave to the Millers, she started her team, heading northwest on the trail to Fort Benton. She didn't look back, though every fiber of her being wanted to. The road ahead was what mattered now: her uncle, the trading post, the new life waiting for her. Yet as the miles passed beneath her repaired wagon, Willow found her thoughts returning again and again to storm gray eyes and a gentle kiss beneath Montana stars. Fort Benton sat on the banks of the Missouri River, a bustling hub of commerce despite its frontier location. Steamboats from St. Louis docked at its levee, unloading supplies and passengers before taking on furs, hides, and other territorial products for the return journey. Streets lined with false-fronted businesses gave the town an air of permanence that was still rare in the territory. Willow's arrival at Nielsen's trading post caused quite a stir. Her uncle, a barrel-chested man with a shock of white hair and the same determined chin as her father, rushed out to meet her, his weathered face breaking into a wide smile. "Look at you," Henry Nielsen exclaimed, helping her down from the wagon. "Jacob's daughter all grown up. Last time I saw you, you were knee-high to a grasshopper." "It's been a long time, Uncle Henry," Willow agreed, returning his enthusiastic embrace. "Too long," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Your father should have brought you out to visit, but then Rachel never did care for the uncultured wilderness, as she called it." "Mother preferred city comforts," Willow acknowledged diplomatically. Henry helped her inside the trading post, a substantial two-story building with living quarters above the store. The main floor was crowded with merchandise of every description: tools, fabric, preserved foods, ammunition, clothing, and luxury items that must have come upriver on the most recent steamboat. "It's not St. Louis," Henry said, watching her take it all in, "but we do all right." "It's wonderful," Willow assured him, already noting the logical organization of the stock and the clean, well-maintained appearance of the store. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Willow settled into her new home and began learning the details of the trading post business. Henry was clearly relieved to have her there. His eyesight was failing, making the account books increasingly difficult for him to manage, and the physical demands of running the store were taking their toll on his aging body. Willow took to the work naturally, her head for figures and her father's training serving her well. She found she enjoyed the varied customers, from rough-hewn trappers and miners to Army officers from the nearby fort, Native Americans from several tribes, and the growing number of settlers establishing homesteads throughout the region. Fort Benton society, such as it was, welcomed her with curious enthusiasm. As one of the few single women of appropriate age in the area, Willow soon found herself receiving invitations to socials, church events, and dinner parties. Several eligible men made their interest known, from the young doctor recently arrived from Philadelphia to the widowed banker whose children needed a mother. Willow was polite but non-committal to all suitors. Her focus remained on helping her uncle and learning every aspect of the business she would likely inherit. And if, in quiet moments, her thoughts drifted to a certain gray-eyed cowboy, well, that was her private affair. Summer faded into fall, the prairie grasses turning golden beneath the endless Montana sky. Willow received occasional letters from Sarah Miller, updating her on family news and local happenings. Each letter concluded with a casual inquiry about whether she'd heard anything from that nice Mr. Jensen who helped with the wagon. Willow's replies were equally casual, stating truthfully that she had not. The folded paper with directions to Double Creek remained in her dresser drawer, taken out occasionally when she was alone, its creases growing soft with handling. Twice she began letters to Xavier, only to discard them, uncertain what she could possibly say that wouldn't sound foolish or presumptuous after a brief acquaintance and a single kiss. October brought the first snow flurries and preparations for winter. The last steamboats of the season arrived, bringing final shipments of goods before ice closed the river until spring. Henry and Willow worked long hours, taking inventory and ensuring they had sufficient stock to last through the isolated winter months. It was during this busy period that Willow, checking in a shipment of winter boots, looked up to find Xavier Jensen standing in the doorway of the trading post, hat in hand, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray autumn light. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining him a phantom conjured by too many quiet thoughts. Then he stepped forward, snow melting on the shoulders of his heavy coat, and she knew he was real. "Miss Nielsen," he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the propriety of his address. "I hope I find you well." Willow's heart thundered in her chest as she set aside her inventory ledger. "Mr. Jensen, this is unexpected." A hint of uncertainty crossed his features. "I'm here on business. Double Creek needed supplies, and with the river closing soon." He gestured vaguely toward the store around them. "Of course," Willow said, professional instincts taking over despite the riot of emotions inside her. "What can we help you with today?" Uncle Henry appeared from the storeroom, his eyebrows rising at the sight of their visitor. Introductions were made, and soon the men were deep in discussion about the ranch's winter requirements. Willow assisted, maintaining a composed exterior while her mind raced with questions. Why had Xavier really come? The Double Creek Ranch had closer trading posts than Fort Benton, and why now, after months of silence? By late afternoon, the business was concluded, with arrangements made for the supplies to be delivered to the Double Creek outfit the following day. Henry, noticing the glances exchanged between his niece and the tall cowboy, tactfully invited Xavier to join them for supper. "We've plenty, and it saves you paying for a meal at the hotel," he offered. "Willow's become quite the cook these past months." Xavier accepted with a grace that suggested he'd been hoping for just such an invitation. As they closed the store for the day and moved upstairs to the living quarters, Willow found herself hyper-aware of his presence, the sound of his boots on the wooden stairs, the clean scent of pine soap that clung to him beneath the leather and wool of his outdoor clothing. Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair. Henry was an excellent host, drawing Xavier out about ranch conditions and the changing cattle market. Willow contributed to the conversation when appropriate, but found herself content to observe Xavier noting the new lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hair had grown slightly longer since summer, the confidence in his bearing that spoke of a man secure in his place in the world. After the meal, Henry claimed fatigue and retired early, leaving Willow and Xavier alone in the small sitting room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the simple but comfortable furnishings. "Your uncle is a good man," Xavier observed, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "He is," Willow agreed. "I'm fortunate to have him." Another silence stretched, this one heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Xavier set aside his coffee cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I didn't come just for supplies," he admitted, his voice low. "I needed to see you," Willow's breath caught. "Why?" His gaze was steady, unwavering. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day we parted at the Miller place." 3 months is a long time to think without acting, she observed, her tone gentler than her words. "I needed to be sure," Xavier explained, "that it wasn't just the circumstances, the danger, the storm, the isolation, that what I felt was real. And is it more real than anything I've known?" He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the darkened street below. "I told myself a woman like you, educated, refined, wouldn't want a man like me, a cowhand with nothing but a few savings and dreams of his own place someday." Willow rose as well, drawn to him by the quiet vulnerability in his voice. "You don't know me very well if you think those things matter to me." Xavier turned to face her, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "What does matter to you, Willow?" "Honesty, courage, kindness." She took a step closer. "The kind of man who would shoulder a broken wagon to help a stranger." His smile was sudden and transformative, lighting his entire face. "I've thought about that day so often, how different my life might have been if I'd taken another trail. As have I." Willow's voice was soft with wonder. Such a small thing, a broken axle, to change everything. Xavier reached for her hands, holding them gently in his larger ones. "I've made arrangements with Double Creek. I'm leaving after winter, bought a small spread near Clearwater Creek. It's not much yet, but with work." "You're staying in Montana then? This territory's in my blood now." His thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands. "I came to ask if you might consider visiting when spring comes, to see the place, to see if—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "To see if there might be a place for you there, with me." Willow's heart soared at his words, even as practical considerations raced through her mind: the trading post, her uncle, the life she was building in Fort Benton. "I can't make promises," she said honestly. "My uncle needs me, and I've committed to helping him." "I understand," Xavier said quickly. "I'm not asking for immediate answers, just possibility." Willow studied his face, the earnest gray eyes, the strong lines of his jaw, the honesty written in every feature. Here was a man who had ridden 2 days in the beginnings of winter, not to stake an immediate claim, but to open a door to what might be. "Possibility," she echoed, moving closer until only inches separated them. "Yes, I think there's definitely that." Xavier's smile was brilliant as he bent to kiss her, no longer the hesitant brush of lips they'd shared at the Miller homestead, but a promise, deep and true. Willow's arms wound around his neck as she returned the kiss, her heart finding its rhythm with his. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should go. Your reputation—" Willow laughed softly. "My reputation in Fort Benton is already that of an unconventional woman who helps run a trading post. I think it can withstand a properly conducted courtship." "Is that what this is? A courtship?" There was wonder in his voice. "What would you call it, Mr. Jensen?" she teased gently. "The best decision I ever made," he replied without hesitation. Winter in Montana was as harsh as it was beautiful. The Missouri River froze solid, steamboat traffic ceased, and Fort Benton settled into the quiet isolation of the season. For Willow and Xavier, however, the cold months marked the beginning of something warm and wonderful. Xavier took a room at the hotel in town, ostensibly to oversee the distribution of supplies to Double Creek, but primarily to spend time with Willow. They conducted their courtship with propriety enough to satisfy even the most gossip-prone residents of Fort Benton. Chaperone dinners, walks along the frozen riverfront, attendance at church services and community socials, all under the approving eye of Uncle Henry, who had taken an immediate liking to the serious young rancher. As they spent time together, their knowledge of each other deepened. Xavier shared more of his past, his childhood in Missouri, the death of his parents that had set him adrift at 17, his journey west in search of purpose. He spoke of mistakes made and lessons learned, of the ranch foreman who had mentored him, and of his gradual understanding that Montana was where he belonged. Willow, in turn, revealed her own struggles, the tension between her mother's expectations of ladylike behavior and her father's encouragement of her practical abilities, her grief at losing both parents, her determination to forge her own path, despite society's limitations on women. By Christmas, their attachment was obvious to everyone in Fort Benton. Xavier joined the Nielsens for the holiday dinner, bringing thoughtful gifts: a fine leather-bound ledger for Willow to use in the store, a magnifying glass with a carved handle to aid Henry's failing eyesight. Willow's gift to Xavier was more personal: a hand-knitted scarf in the colors of the Montana landscape, and a small painted watercolor of the lined shack where they had sheltered during the storm. "To remember where it began," she said as he unwrapped it. Xavier's fingers traced the simple image with reverence. "As if I could ever forget." January brought bitter cold and deep snow that isolated Fort Benton further. Xavier's planned departure for Double Creek was delayed by impassable trails, a circumstance that neither he nor Willow particularly regretted. During these quiet weeks, they began to plan in earnest. Xavier's property near Clearwater Creek had potential: good water, decent grazing, and enough tillable soil to grow hay and garden crops. The cabin was rough but could be improved. With careful management and hard work, it could become a viable ranch within a few years. The question of Willow's commitment to her uncle remained. Henry, noticing their serious discussions, finally broached the subject himself one evening as they sat by the fire. "You two are making plans," he observed, setting aside his pipe. "Don't think I haven't noticed." Willow exchanged a glance with Xavier. "We've been discussing possibilities," she admitted. Henry nodded thoughtfully. "And you're worried about the trading post, about me." "Uncle Henry, I promised to help you, and you have," he interrupted gently. "These past months you've organized the books better than they've been in years, improved our ordering system, and brought in new customers with those window displays you're so clever with." His faded blue eyes twinkled. "But I'm not dead yet, girl, just old. I can still run this place." "But your eyes are failing, yes, but my mind isn't." Henry leaned forward. "Truth is, I've been thinking of taking on a partner, young fellow named Caldwell who used to clerk for me. He's expressed interest, and with your improvements to the business, it's a more attractive proposition." Willow stared at her uncle in surprise. "You never mentioned this. Didn't want to influence your decisions." Henry's gaze shifted to include Xavier. "A person's heart has to lead the way in some matters." Xavier cleared his throat, clearly moved by the old man's words. "Sir, I want you to know that I would never ask Willow to choose between her family, and of course you wouldn't," Henry interrupted with a dismissive wave. "That's precisely why I approve of you, Jensen. You understand what's important." He fixed them both with a stern look. "Now, stop worrying about an old man and make your plans. Just promise you'll visit often enough that I can spoil any grandnieces or grandnephews that might come along." With Henry's blessing, the last obstacle to their future seemed removed. Yet as February's end approached, bringing with it the likelihood of trails clearing enough for travel, Willow found herself increasingly troubled. One evening, as they walked back from a community dance, she finally voiced her concerns to Xavier. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked, her breath clouding in the cold night air. "What if I'm not suited to ranch life? What if the sky falls?" Xavier finished with gentle humor. He stopped, turning to face her beneath the star-filled sky. "Willow, nothing in life is certain. We can only make the best decisions we can with what we know now." "And what do we know?" His gloved hands cupped her face tenderly. "We know that when your wagon broke down on that hill, something extraordinary began. We know that despite all logic and probability, we found each other. We know that I love you more than I thought it possible to love anyone." Willow's heart swelled at his words, but practicality still compelled her to voice her deepest fear. "What if love isn't enough?" Xavier considered this seriously. "Then we adjust, we adapt. If the ranch doesn't work, we try something else. If you're unhappy there, we move. The only failure would be in not trying at all." His certainty, not in any specific outcome but in their ability to face whatever came together, calmed something deep inside Willow. She rose on tiptoes to kiss him, no longer caring who might see them on the moonlit street. "I love you, Xavier Jensen," she whispered against his lips. "And I want to build a life with you, whatever form it takes." The trails began to clear in early March, and Xavier could delay his departure no longer. Double Creek needed their foreman to prepare for spring calving, and his own property required attention before planting season. Their parting was bittersweet, tempered by the knowledge that it was temporary. Xavier would return in May when the trading post was less busy, and they would be married in Fort Benton before traveling to their new home. "It's not so very long," Xavier reassured her as he prepared to ride out. "Just 8 weeks." 8 weeks and 3 days, Willow corrected, trying to smile through her tears. He kissed her one last time, then mounted his horse. "I'll ride as often as mail can get through." "You'd better," she warned, stepping back as he turned his horse toward the south road. Willow watched until he disappeared from view, then returned to the trading post, already counting the days until May. Spring brought renewal to the Montana territory. The Missouri River broke free of ice, steamboats once again appeared at Fort Benton's levee, and the trading post bustled with activity. Willow threw herself into work, finding that busy days made the time pass more quickly. Xavier's letters arrived sporadically, carried by whoever happened to be traveling between the ranch and Fort Benton. His handwriting was as straightforward as the man himself, clear, honest, and occasionally revealing a poetic soul beneath the practical exterior. He wrote of preparations for their life together, improvements to the cabin, and his growing certainty that they were making the right choice. April brought an unexpected visitor to Nielsen's trading post, Thomas Miller, arriving to deliver goods from his homestead and neighboring farms. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're faring," he explained after greetings were exchanged. "Sarah insisted I check on you." Over dinner that evening, Thomas shared news of his family and updates on local happenings. Finally, with a twinkle in his eye, he produced a letter from his coat pocket. "Ran into Jensen at Clearwater Creek last week," he said, handing the envelope to Willow. "He asked me to deliver this personally, said the regular mail was too slow for a man counting days." Willow took the letter with eager hands, recognizing Xavier's bold script across the front. "How did he look?" Thomas chuckled. "Like a man working from sunup to sundown. He's putting everything he has into that place of his, building a proper bedroom addition to the cabin, planting a vegetable garden that would make Sarah envious." He paused, his expression growing serious. "He's a good man, Miss Nielsen, works harder than most I've known." "I know," Willow said softly, the letter precious in her hands. Later, alone in her room, she opened the envelope to find not only Xavier's usual update but a pressed wildflower, a brilliant blue Montana bluebell. First harbinger of spring, and a simple sketch of the improved cabin, with a garden fence and smoke curling from the chimney. Beneath the drawing, Xavier had written, "Home is waiting for you." May arrived with unexpected warmth, bringing the prairie to life with wildflowers and new growth. The date of Xavier's return approached, and Willow found herself alternately excited and nervous. Wedding preparations, though modest by St. Louis standards, occupied much of her time when she wasn't working at the trading post. Uncle Henry had insisted on providing a proper celebration. "You only get married once if you do it right," he declared. "And this old man wants to see his niece properly wed before he kicks off." 3 days before Xavier was due to arrive, a rider from Double Creek appeared at the trading post, his expression grim. Willow's heart nearly stopped when she saw him, fear clutching at her throat. "Miss Nielsen?" the young cowhand asked, removing his hat. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely audible. "Is it Xavier? Is he hurt?" The rider shook his head quickly. "No, madam, Mr. Jensen's fine, but there's been trouble at the ranch. Rustlers hit us hard 3 nights ago. Took nearly 30 head and injured 2 of our men. Mr. Jensen sent me to tell you he'll be delayed. They're tracking the thieves now." Relief that Xavier wasn't injured quickly gave way to concern about the dangerous situation. Cattle rustling often led to violence, and posses pursuing thieves sometimes didn't return. "How delayed?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can't say for sure, madam. Mr. Jensen said to tell you he'll come as soon as it's resolved, but it could be a week, maybe more." Willow nodded, thanking the rider and offering him a meal before he continued his journey. That night she wrote to Xavier, expressing her concern for his safety and assuring him that she understood the delay. The wedding could wait, his safe return could not. 1 week stretched into 2. May was drawing to a close when Willow, arranging a display of new goods near the trading post window, glanced outside and saw a familiar figure dismounting before the hitching rail. She was out the door before conscious thought, flying across the boardwalk and into Xavier's arms. He caught her with a laugh that turned into a groan, and Willow pulled back in alarm. "You're hurt," she accused, noticing how he favored his left side. "It's nothing," Xavier assured her, though the lines of pain around his eyes belied his words. "Just a cracked rib." Doc at Double Creek wrapped it tight. Willow led him inside, where Uncle Henry greeted him with a hearty handshake and immediate concern about his injury. Only when Xavier was settled with coffee did they press him for details. The story emerged gradually. The rustlers had been tracked to a remote canyon where they were holding the stolen cattle. A confrontation ensued, gunfire was exchanged, and Xavier had taken a fall from his horse while pursuing one of the thieves. "We recovered most of the cattle," he concluded. "And the sheriff has 2 of the rustlers in custody. The others won't be back. They know Double Creek isn't easy pickings." "And your rib," Willow pressed, still concerned. Xavier's smile was rueful. "We'll mend in time, but I'm afraid our wedding trip might be less adventurous than planned. No breaking wild broncos for a few weeks." "I believe I can adapt to that disappointment," Willow replied dryly, relief making her almost giddy. The wedding took place 3 days later in Fort Benton's small church. Willow wore a simple dress of blue silk that matched the Montana sky, with wildflowers in her hair rather than a veil. Xavier, his injury carefully concealed beneath his best shirt and vest, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such pure happiness that several of the town's more sentimental ladies dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward at Nielsen's trading post was a community affair, with what seemed like half of Fort Benton in attendance. There was music, dancing, though Xavier was excused due to his injury, and enough food to feed a cattle drive. As evening fell, the newlyweds slipped away from the festivities, climbing into the same wagon that had first brought them together, now repaired, repainted, and decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion. "Ready, Mrs. Jensen?" Xavier asked, gathering the reins. Willow looked back at the trading post at Uncle Henry standing on the porch waving goodbye at the life she had built here over the past year. Then she turned to her husband, seeing in his eyes the promise of the life to come. "Ready," she confirmed, settling beside him on the wagon seat. As they drove away from Fort Benton, following the now familiar trail toward their new home, Willow reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together: a broken axle on a steep grade, a cowboy's offer of help, a journey that had led to love. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Willow smiled, leaning against his uninjured side. "I was thinking that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. If my wagon hadn't broken that day, I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Xavier said, his arm tightening around her. "Some things are just meant to be." Whether it was fate, chance, or simple good fortune, Willow and Xavier's journey together had only just begun. Ahead lay their ranch near Clearwater Creek, the cabin Xavier had prepared with such care, and all the challenges and joys of building a life together in the vast Montana territory. The wagon rolled steadily forward into the gathering dusk, carrying them toward home. 5 years passed, turning the fledgling ranch into a thriving homestead that was the pride of the region around Clearwater Creek. The rough cabin had been transformed into a proper house with a covered porch, glass windows, and enough room for a growing family. Fields of hay and oats stretched to the east, while cattle grazed the rolling hills to the north and west. On a warm summer morning, Willow stood on that porch, watching Xavier teaching their 4-year-old son, Henry, to ride his pony in the fenced yard. The boy sat tall in the small saddle, his father's hand steady on his back as the gentle pony walked in circles. Little Emma, not quite 2, clung to Willow's skirts, watching her brother with wide-eyed fascination. "Me ride too, Mama," she declared, pointing imperiously toward the pony. Willow laughed, lifting her daughter into her arms. "When you're bigger, little one. For now, you can watch Henry." Xavier looked up at the sound of their voices, his smile as warm and genuine as it had been on their wedding day. The years of ranch work had added new lines to his face and streaks of silver at his temples, but his eyes still held that same steady strength that had first drawn Willow to him. "She's going to be riding before she can properly walk, this one," he called, leading the pony toward the porch. "Just like her mama. I was considerably older than 2 when I learned to ride," Willow protested, though she couldn't deny that Emma showed every sign of inheriting her parents' determination. Henry beamed from his perch on the pony. "Look, Mama, I'm riding all by myself." "Indeed you are," Willow agreed proudly. "A true horseman already." Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching riders. Xavier's hand instinctively moved to his hip, where his pistol would normally be holstered, a habit from the early days when unexpected visitors sometimes meant trouble. But those times had largely passed as the territory grew more settled. "It's Uncle Henry," their son exclaimed, recognizing the lead wagon. Sure enough, Henry Nielsen's familiar figure could be seen driving the vehicle, with several riders flanking him. Monthly visits from Fort Benton had become a tradition, with Uncle Henry never missing an opportunity to spoil his namesake and little Emma. Xavier lifted his son from the pony and set him on his feet. "Go get cleaned up, partner. Your great uncle always notices dirty hands." As Henry raced into the house, Willow handed Emma to Xavier and straightened her apron. "I wasn't expecting him until next week. I hope nothing's wrong." Xavier bounced Emma in his arms, making her giggle. "Knowing your uncle, he just couldn't wait to see the children." The wagon and riders pulled into the yard, and Henry Nielsen climbed down with the help of a younger man, his business partner, James Caldwell, who had indeed taken partial ownership of the trading post as planned. "There they are," Henry boomed, opening his arms wide. "My favorite people in all of Montana." Greetings and embraces were exchanged, with little Emma immediately demanding to be held by her great uncle and young Henry appearing from the house to show off his new boots. The additional riders turned out to be Thomas Miller and his oldest son, who had business in the area and had joined Henry's party for the journey. "Quite the coincidence," Willow observed, helping Sarah unpack the basket of preserves she'd brought. "The Millers arriving at the same time." Sarah's eyes twinkled mysteriously. "Not entirely a coincidence, dear. We've been planning this little gathering for some time." Before Willow could question her further, Uncle Henry called for everyone's attention. He stood on the porch, one hand resting on young Henry's shoulder, the other holding a document of some kind. "5 years ago today," he announced, "two of the finest people I know were joined in marriage after the most unlikely of meetings, a broken wagon axle and a cowboy willing to shoulder the load." He unfolded the document with a flourish. "To commemorate this occasion, and to ensure that this piece of Montana remains in the family for generations to come, I've finalized the purchase of the adjacent Henderson property." Willow gasped, looking to Xavier, who appeared equally shocked. The Henderson land, a fertile stretch bordering their property to the south, had been for sale for months, but at a price well beyond their current means. "Uncle Henry, you can't possibly," Willow began. "Cannon did," Henry interrupted with satisfaction. "Not as a gift, though Lord knows you both deserve one, but as an investment in our family's future. The deed's in both your names, with a proper business arrangement attached that gives me a small share of profits for 10 years, after which it converts fully to you." Xavier stepped forward, emotion evident in his face. "Sir, this is incredibly generous." "It's incredibly practical," Henry corrected, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "James and I are doing well with the trading post, but diversification is just good business. And who better to manage this land than the two most hardworking people I know?" Celebrations continued throughout the day and into evening. A special dinner was prepared, stories were shared, and plans for the expanded ranch were enthusiastically discussed. As twilight fell, the children were put to bed, and the adults gathered on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air. Willow slipped her hand into Xavier's as they watched the first stars appear. "Can you believe how far we've come?" she asked softly. "From a broken axle on a hill to this." Xavier's fingers tightened around hers. "Every day I'm grateful for that axle breaking precisely when and where it did." From inside came the sound of laughter as Thomas regaled the others with some tale or other. Their home was full of friends and family, warmth and love. Beyond the house stretched the land they had worked so hard to nurture, land that would now grow with Uncle Henry's generous investment. "Do you ever miss it?" Xavier asked suddenly. "The trading post, town life?" Willow considered the question seriously, as she did all things. "I miss Uncle Henry's daily company," she admitted. And occasionally I miss the variety of people who came through the store. She turned to face her husband, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. But I have never, not for a single moment, regretted choosing this life with you. Xavier bent to kiss her, his lips as tender as they had been that first night under Montana stars. Nor I with you. From inside, Uncle Henry called for them to rejoin the party. Apparently young Henry had awoken and was insisting on showing his great-uncle a new trick with his toy horses. Laughing, Willow and Xavier turned to go inside, arms around each other's waists. As they stepped through the doorway into the warm light of their home, Willow glanced back at the star-filled Montana sky. So much had changed since that fateful day when her wagon axle snapped on the grade. So much had been gained, and it had all begun with 7 simple words from a stranger who would become the center of her world. "I'll shoulder it, you guide the team."